The world was already changing, though few yet understood how deeply the change ran. Across the scattered lands of Middle-earth, whispers of unrest spread like faint smoke across a dark horizon. The long quiet that had endured since the fall of Númenor, and later since the War of the Last Alliance, was fraying thread by thread. Men spoke of shadows in the east, of a power stirring where none should rise, and even the most hardened captains could not dismiss the signs. Merchants whispered of strange gatherings at crossroads, of riders who did not speak, of storms that seemed to brood above the mountains without passing. Elves, already weary with centuries of loss, looked westward with greater longing, for they too sensed the tremors beneath the surface of the world. The grey pilgrim walked among these lands with eyes keener than most, yet even Gandalf carried no certainty. He had seen kingdoms fall into ruin, not from sudden fire, but from slow corruption, and he knew that what lay ahead would test more than swords and banners. The first hints of Sauron's return were not armies or fortresses, but silence. Unnatural silences where voices once carried, silences that seemed to listen back. From the towers of the west to the wild plains where men hunted, this silence grew heavier, as though waiting for something to declare itself. Barad-dûr had been broken once, its great foundations cracked, its master cast into shadow. Yet nothing forged by the Dark Lord's will was ever truly destroyed while his spirit endured. Stones could be toppled and spires levelled, but the foundations of the tower were bound to the One Ring itself, and though the ring lay lost, Sauron's hand, diminished though it was, still reached out. Slowly, the fortress stirred again. Block by block, spell by spell, it rose out of the blackened plain, each addition a proclamation that its master had returned. To look upon it was to know that the silence had been broken, that the shadow had a body once more. Yet most of Middle-earth did not see this. To the Shire, the world remained simple, the seasons gentle, the smoke of hearths rising untroubled. To Rohan, the danger seemed only the quarrels of horse lords and neighbours. Even in Gondor, where the watchfires once blazed at every border, many grew tired of waiting for a threat that never fully declared itself. This was the peril that Gandalf perceived more clearly than others, that Sauron's strength did not need to announce itself in battle when it could first thrive in neglect. The growing shadow pressed on Gandalf's thoughts in ways he could not easily share. His mission was not conquest, nor even command. It was to shepherd, to guard, to awaken hearts against complacency. Yet how could he rouse them without proof? How could he call them to vigilance when they had wearied of waiting? These questions haunted him as he crossed the plains, as he lingered in smoky halls, as he sought counsel in secret. Each land offered signs, each sign another fragment of a vast design only he seemed willing to name. And behind it all, the image of the Black Tower returned to him again and again, though he had not yet stood before it in this age. He remembered whispers in the air, traces of power lingering from the last war, hints of a will that had never fully broken. Barad-dûr was not merely a fortress, it was the vessel of Sauron's being, a mirror of his hunger to dominate. To speak of it was to speak of a living presence, something that endured not as stone, but as will. Thus the stage was set, though the players did not yet realize what role they would serve. Gondor fortified its walls, but doubted its need. The elves turned their eyes toward the west, but still clung to their fading realms. The dwarves kept to their mountains, hearing little but their own labor. Only Gandalf, moving unseen, perceived the pattern tightening around them all. The world slept on the edge of awakening, and already the first stirrings of that dark awakening called him toward choices no counsel could make for him. The silence that lay upon Middle-earth was not born of chance, nor was Gandalf's vigilance the product of his own unease alone. To understand why he moved as he did, why his steps were guided into shadows no one else dared tread, we must look further back, beyond the plains of Gondor, beyond the forests of Eriador, and even beyond the histories remembered by elves. His presence among the free peoples was no ordinary wandering. It was the embodiment of a covenant forged long before the first rising of Sauron's fortress. Gandalf, known in the West as Mithrandir, was not truly of mortal kind. He was one of the Maiar, a spirit sent under the mandate of the Valar themselves, entrusted with a task that could not be met by armies or kings. When the Valar perceived that Sauron's shadow might yet return, they did not answer with overwhelming force, though such power was within their reach. They had learned from the ruin of Númenor what devastation such intervention could bring. Instead, they chose a subtler path, to send guides, clothed in humility, who would walk among elves and men, not as conquerors, but as companions. Thus the Istari came, 5 in number, bearing the likeness of age, so that their wisdom might be heeded without fear. Saruman the White, learned in craft, Radagast the Brown, keeper of the wild, and the 2 blue wizards who vanished eastward into mystery. And Gandalf, the grey pilgrim, who alone among them bore the deepest patience of heart. The charge placed upon him was both gift and burden. He was forbidden to wield his full might in open contest, lest he fall into the very temptation of domination that had undone so many before him. Instead, he was to kindle resistance, to awaken courage in the hearts of those who might otherwise falter. His strength would be measured not in victories claimed, but in victories enabled by others. This constraint, gentle to describe, yet heavy to bear, shaped every step he would take. To face Sauron openly was to risk failure of the mandate itself, for it was never his task to overthrow the Dark Lord by power, but to ensure that Middle-earth might resist him together. Yet even mandates leave room for judgment, and Gandalf carried within him the freedom to act as his wisdom demanded. Where Saruman lingered in lofty studies and counsels of pride, Gandalf wandered restlessly, seeking truths hidden in the forgotten corners of the world. He walked among hobbits when no one else thought them worthy of notice, and it was his voice that first urged vigilance when whispers of shadow grew. Every path he chose bent toward the same unseen end, not to command the free peoples, but to ready them for trials they did not yet imagine. Still, a paradox stirred within him. If he was bound never to dominate, how then could he step into the very heart of Sauron's realm? How could one who was forbidden to impose his wills withstand the fortress built from will incarnate? These questions weighed heavily, for his charge seemed to demand both humility and confrontation. The day would come when he would test the limits of that paradox, and in doing so, walk a road no other Istar dared to follow. And so, the shadow of Barad-dûr drew nearer in thought, if not yet in step, its presence demanding an answer. To understand how Gandalf faced that test, we must first see the nature of the tower itself. the citadel of darkness rising from stone, and will alike, a place where no mere traveller could stand without being unmade. Barad-dûr was no ordinary fortress, and to speak of it as if it were only walls and towers is to miss its essence. It was never merely a construction of stone raised above the blackened plain. It was an extension of Sauron's being, drawn out of his malice and bound to endure so long as the One Ring endured. When the last alliance stormed Mordor, and the ring was cut from his hand, the fortress fell, shattered into ruin, its mighty spires collapsing into the dust of Gorgoroth. Yet the foundations remained, imperishable, because they were intertwined with the Dark Lord's own spirit. No triumph of arms could wholly undo what he had poured into the stones. So long as his essence lingered, the Black Tower could not be erased. For long years the plain lay in silence, a graveyard of jagged ruins where carrion birds circled, and no mortal dared settle. Yet beneath the surface, the will that had once commanded armies did not sleep. Sauron's spirit, wandering houseless, gathered strength in secrecy, weaving itself back into form. By the time whispers of his servants reached the borders of Gondor, the tower was already rising again. First came the scaffolds of shadow, unseen by most eyes. Then came the visible marks, battlements reforged, iron gates rehung, the eye of fire kindling once more within the heart of its highest chamber. The Dark Lord had returned, and with him his house of domination. To approach Barad-dûr was to approach a living presence. The walls did not merely stand, they leaned inward, oppressive, as though watching. The great battlements seemed to echo with voices not heard but felt, an unending reminder that this was not a structure built for shelter, but for subjugation. Its towers proclaimed dominion over all who saw them, and the very air around them was heavy, as though the sky itself bent beneath the weight of will. Those who ventured too near felt themselves diminished, their thoughts turning inward, doubts multiplying, courage leaking away. The fortress did not need to strike. It bled resistance dry simply by existing. Here lay the paradox that Gandalf must face. The mandate forbade him from using domination. Yet to walk into Barad-dûr was to step into the embodiment of domination itself. To endure it without succumbing would require more than wisdom. It would demand a strength of spirit that could stand unbent where all else was pressed down. This was the true test hidden behind the black gates, not whether one could breach them with stealth or force, but whether one could enter without being unmade by the will that saturated every stone. The memory of Númenor's ruin whispered through these walls as well, for it was from Númenor's wreckage that Sauron had first gathered the craft to build his tower, binding sorcery and masonry into one. The echoes of that ancient pride, of kings who sought to master death itself, were woven into the mortar. To look upon Barad-dûr was to see the consequence of covenants broken, of wisdom twisted into tyranny. Gandalf, who bore the mandate of restraint, would know that stepping across its threshold was not merely an act of defiance, it was an act of exposure, placing himself within the furnace of corruptions, where every weakness might be drawn out. And yet, this very knowledge did not dissuade him. For if he was to understand Sauron's power fully, if he was to resist not only with words, but with certainty, he would need to stand where no other dared. The Black Tower rose again, a beacon of dread across Mordor, and its rising called him onward. The world outside had not yet grasped its meaning, but Gandalf knew that such a citadel did not rise without cost, nor without a purpose yet to be revealed. Before we may witness how Gandalf crossed the threshold of that living fortress, we must first pause to understand the secret counsels that guided him, the voices of the wise, whose debates shaped his choice to walk alone into shadow. The counsels of the wise were never thunderous affairs, and their debates seldom rang beyond the walls that contained them, yet the currents that moved there shaped the lives of nations as surely as rivers shape valleys. In the hush that followed the first unmistakable signs of Sauron's return, Gandalf took his place among those few who still remembered the world before the great wars, and who felt a duty that could not be set aside. The chamber was chosen for its quiet, and for the way the wind could pass through unseen apertures, carrying away unguarded words. A fire burned low, not for warmth alone, but to keep the mind from wandering. And each face gathered in that circle bore the marks of long vigilance. They did not sit as rulers but as keepers, and the gravity that rested upon them was the gravity of memory, of costs tallied in names rather than numbers. Elrond spoke first, as he often did when the matter touched old griefs, and his voice, steady and spare, reminded them of the last time hope had marched east in banners and song. He spoke not to rekindle pride, but to undercut it, for he recalled how near they had come to final victory, and how swiftly the nearness had turned to loss, when a single hand failed at a single moment. His counsel was the counsel of one who knew that courage, unaccompanied by discernment, could feed the very fires it sought to quench. To him the signs were clear. The enemy, once driven from concealment in the south, had returned to his old ground, and, under other names and other masks, gathered his strength in the east. If the Black Tower truly stirred, it would not be undone by a charge across open fields, nor by proclamations made in haste and echoed by frightened men. It would be met, and perhaps only endured, by a watch that did not blink, and by deeds performed beyond the reach of trumpets. Galadriel listened while the others spoke, and then added few words, yet each word seemed to reveal some hidden seam in the fabric of the matter. She had long urged action, when action would mean the removal of a festering thorn, but the thorn had become a tree whose roots sank deep into the very ash. She acknowledged that the time for driving shadows from abandoned halls had passed, and the time had come for understanding the shape of the shadow's heart. Sauron's strength was not merely the force of his armies, she said, nor the dread of his name. It was the coherence of his will, a terrible unity that turned places into instruments, and men into measures of his purpose. If Barad-dûr had risen again, it was because the will that founded it had never departed, and to oppose it one must learn what made it whole. Her gaze fell on Gandalf as she said this, not as command, but as recognition, because she knew what he had been sent to do, and by what manner of restraint he had been bound. Saruman, robed in dignity, and ringed round by learning, as by a citadel of polished stone, received their words with a patience that hid its own shape. He spoke of prudence and of measures more fitting to the scale of the threat, and no one could fault the logic with which he arranged his arguments. He pointed to the arsenals of law and to the means by which the enemy might be delayed without risking those who held the balance of wisdom. Delay was not surrender, he said, but the right ordering of time, and time remained their most trusted ally, for with time came information, and with information the capacity to act without error. He proposed watches doubled and messages carried in quiet to distant friends. He proposed that certain relics long hidden be consulted, that stones of seeing, if any remained, might be found and read with care by those trained to withstand their lures. He did not forbid the thought of journeying east, yet every syllable of his caution made the east recede a little farther, as though the horizon itself were a thing that could be managed by counsel. Gandalf answered, not with dispute, but with the kind of assent that conceals a single withheld point. He did not oppose the doubling of watches or the quiet warning of old allies, and he agreed that time would be needed to discern the enemy's aims. Yet he also knew that time served two masters, and that the hours which granted clarity to the wise also granted latitude to the enemy. The fortress would not stand still while they learned its angles. It would be expanded and sealed, and made more like the will that built it, until no messenger could pass that way unseen. He spoke of small signs gathered on long roads, of creatures that had begun to move again under the power of old names, of the pale residue of fear carried by those who had strayed too near. He did not claim certainty, but he made a case for necessary nearness, that if they were to match Sauron's unity with something other than mere defiance, they must find the seam along which that unity could be tested, and seams, he suggested gently, are found by the hand that touches the stone. Elrond's reply carried the weight of protective love, not restriction. He reminded Gandalf of his charge, of the self-chosen limits that made his counsel trustworthy, and of the way dominion can wear 1,000 kindly masks before it is recognized. He did not forbid the thought that was forming, yet he asked its price, for every act exacts one, and he had outlived too many promises made in zeal. He asked who would be left to gather the free peoples, if the one most trusted among them were lost or broken, and he asked whether any knowledge gained would balance the harm done to hope by such a loss. Gandalf, hearing this, did not flinch, because the questions were the right ones, and had long inhabited his own thoughts. Galadriel's voice, when it came again, was quiet, as if she answered a matter already concluded in another room that none of them would ever enter. She reminded them that secrecy had its own gravity, and that wisdom, kept too long in darkness, could curdle into fear. If Gandalf went, he would go not as a challenger, but as a witness. He would not take with him the power to dominate, and therefore he would not be permitted the consolations of victory. He would go to see, to withstand, and to carry back not trophies, but bearings, so that choices made later would have the feel of ground beneath them. She spoke of the way a place can unmake the one who enters it, if he carries within him a hunger for mastery, and she spoke, without lavishness, of Gandalf's long record of refusing such hunger. She did not command. She recognized. Saruman's objections grew more polished as the possibility hardened into an intent. He spoke of alternatives, of agents sent in Gandalf's stead, of eyes that could read the edges of shadow from a safer remove, of the very birds and beasts that might carry fragments of truth on their wings and in their whispers. He praised Gandalf's humility, and then used that praise as a lever to move him away from peril. For if humility was the heart of his strength, why place it in the furnace where all such virtues are attacked at their roots? The logic was exemplary, but there ran beneath it a quiet tremor, a thread of offense taken at the prospect of knowledge gained without his keeping. Others heard it only as nuance, if they heard it at all. Gandalf heard it as a warning about the kinds of counsel pride can render convincing. The conversation turned, as such conversations must, toward particulars that would remain unrecorded. They spoke of routes no map contained, and of lacunae in the enemy's sight that might permit a single traveller to pass like a shadow across a windless field. They spoke of tokens that should not be carried, of lights that should not be kindled, of words that must not be spoken even in defence. For the craft of Mordor resembles a series of locks to which anger, fear, and triumph each provide a key. Gandalf asked questions that seemed to resist their own answers, testing the plan not for brilliance, but for sobriety. If he turned back, how would the turn be chosen? If he were forced to speak, what words would he spend, and what would he leave unspent? If he were recognized, what would be the smallest true thing he could say that would purchase departure without poisoning hope? No one pretended to a mastery of these matters. They prepared him the way one prepares a sailor, by naming stars he may never see, and currents he will feel only after they have already taken hold of his keel. At last the council rested, not in unanimity, for unanimity among the wise was rare, but in a formed silence that admitted the deed and accepted the weight of it. Elrond offered hospitality that would be refused with thanks, for the road ahead could not be begun in comfort without inviting its corruption. Galadriel gave no talisman to be flourished at a moment of crisis, and yet something in her gaze steadied the hand as surely as any visible gift could have done. Saruman, courteous to the end, promised research and watchfulness, and none there doubted he would keep that promise in the form that best suited him. The fire fell to embers, the wind passed once more through the high apertures, and Gandalf, who had neither demanded permission nor sought absolution, took upon himself the responsibility that comes of clear perception joined to chosen restraint. He left them not as a hero sent forth by decree, but as a servant who had listened and decided. Even as he walked away from their counsel, the arguments he had heard arranged themselves within him, not as burdens that bore him down, but as safeguards set along the path, each one reminding him of what must not be risked in pursuit of what must be learned. He allowed no anger into his steps, because anger speaks too plainly for those who listen for vulnerabilities, and he permitted no foretaste of triumph, because triumph signals itself even in the posture of a back. He carried with him a memory of earlier roads, of the necromancer's lair, driven out by alliance, of long watches held beneath indifferent stars, of the stubborn mercy he had learned among small folk who knew nothing of towers. And these memories served him as a kind of compass when the maps would fail. There remained, however, the matter of secrecy, for secrecy must be kept not only from foes, but from friends, and this is often the sharper task. He told no more than was needed to those who would miss him, and even that telling was made in the language of errands and visits, the ordinary phrases by which lives are threaded together. To ask another to keep a secret is to bid him take a share of your danger, and Gandalf would not lay that weight upon those whose strength must be reserved for trials yet unseen. He left messages that could mean many things, and meant them all, and he arranged returns that could be delayed without prompting alarm, so that absence would seem like a form of his habitual wandering rather than a rupture in the pattern of days. On the night before he set out, he stood alone beneath a sky that had not forgotten how to be beautiful, and he let the quiet of it settle into his bones. He reminded himself, not by argument, but by recollection, that he had been sent to kindle and to guide, and that nothing he would see in the days to come could be allowed to alter that mandate. He rehearsed, as one rehearses the shape of a prayer, the refusal at the core of his calling, the refusal to break wills in the name of rescue, the refusal to become the thing that must be opposed, the refusal to let fear draw exact measures where compassion writes in long curves. He considered, too, the limits of his body, for the enemy loved to exploit what is most ordinary in us, and he prepared for cold and hunger, and the fatigue that turns caution into a negotiable suggestion. He permitted himself neither dread nor bravado, but the middle steadiness by which a long road can be kept without collapse. There was, in those last hours, a temptation that he did not name aloud. It came in the shape of help easily requested and easily given, help that would have lifted him above the risk he had accepted and set him, for a time, beyond the reach of ordinary peril. He set the thought aside with gratitude and with a firmness that surprised even him, for he knew that to approach Barad-dûr as one carried would be to arrive as one already answered, and he could not afford to enter that place with any answer but patience. Without that discipline, every gaze becomes a declaration, and every step becomes an argument, and the fortress is very skilled at turning declarations and arguments into invitations it is pleased to accept. Dawn, when it came, did not announce itself with splendor. It appeared as a thinning of shadow along the eastern edge of the hills, and a softening of the stars, and it was enough. Gandalf drew on his grey cloak, simple and worn, not as disguise, but as a reminder of the office that had shaped him. He took up his staff, which was not a weapon in the way soldiers name weapons, but a token of the work for which he had been sent, and he chose a road that did not appear on any chart designed for caravans or couriers. The first miles were the miles of leaving, where every turning whispers that it would not be shameful to depart the errand and return to warmth and voices. The miles after that were the miles of commitment, where memory of counsel and firmness of wills blend into a single motion that cannot easily be unmade. The land opened before him in sequences only a traveller learns, fields that give way to scrubbings of thorn, hills that reveal in their folds the older bones of the earth, and, beyond all that, the long dark ramparts where smoke seems to have been woven into the very air. He moved as he had always moved, as one who belongs to many places, and claims none, and if any who passed him took note, they would have spoken later of a solitary figure, whose pace did not falter, though it seldom hurried. He left behind him the chamber of council with its hearth grown cold, and he carried it within him as warmth carried in a palm, ready to be opened when chill or doubt pressed too near. What had been decided in secret did not diminish as the distance grew. It clarified. With each day, the world simplified into its essentials, where to put the foot and how to place the breath, what to ignore so that what must be seen can be seen, how to let stillness become a shield rather than a vacancy. He slept when he could and where prudence permitted, and in the hours between sleeping and waking, he learned again the small liturgies by which fear is kept from seeding itself in the mind. He counted the familiar constellations and let their old names shoulder some of the weight. He listened for waters hidden in ravines, and accepted the rhythm they offered. He let memories of laughter, scarce and unspectacular, traverse the space inside him, where large thoughts might otherwise loom too near. The roads that lead toward Mordor are not all watched in the same manner, and not all dangers announce themselves in the same key. Some patrols wear iron and believe themselves terrible. Others are eyes without footsteps, woven into crevices of rock and into those patches of sky where a gaze can be set and left to smoulder. Gandalf adjusted his pace to both kinds of watchfulness, using slowness where haste would draw lines around him, and using surety where hesitation would scrawl his presence like a signature across the empty places. He did not permit himself to imagine the tower before its time, for to imagine it too vividly was to carry within him a model the enemy could find and strike. Yet the tower was coming, in its hour and in its order, and the counsel that had prepared him did not fall away. It unfolded. There would be rivers whose banks were not wet in the mortal manner, and crossroads whose signs turned by night to face in different directions, and fields of old glass that remembered fires no rain had ever quenched. There would be decisions made in increments too small to notice until their sum appeared, and there would be the long plain where the air tasted of iron, and where footsteps multiplied themselves in echoes that did not belong to any traveller living. He would need all the art of moving without claim, and of seeing without seizure, and he would need to remember that not all doors are breached by the hand that presses, but some by the hand that waits behind him. The wise kept their watches, and arranged their messages, and performed the quiet labour by which hope is stored against days of need. Before him, the land thinned and hardened, and prepared to yield to a realm that called itself order while practicing the art of erasing. Between these terms he placed himself, not as an arbiter, for that would have required a power he had not been granted, but as a witness who could carry back a truer measure of what they faced. The tower that waited was not a problem to be solved, but a will to be endured, and endurance, rightly held, could become knowledge of a kind no book would ever preserve. When at last the hills ended and the long, ash-stained distances began, he paused and let the world settle again into two truths, that he went alone, and that he did not go unsupported. The first would guard him from the vanity of an audience imagined at his back. The second would steady him against the counterfeit companionship that the enemy offers to all who enter his house. He adjusted the fall of his cloak, set the staff in his right hand, and chose the line across the dark plain that would carry him between patrols and over dry channels whose whispering sand told the stories of storms no cloud had fathered. The hidden road had opened because counsel had agreed to its necessity, and because one heart had accepted its form. He began to walk. The wind, thin and sour, drew the edges of his cloak against his legs, and then forgot him. The sky, drained of colour, promised neither omen nor comfort. The ground, faintly warm where it should have been cold, pressed its warning upward through the soles of his boots. Ahead, beyond visibility, lay the first threshold, and the watchers set to guard it, and beyond that, the gate that is less a passage than a decision. He kept his breath even and his gaze soft, and he measured his steps not by the fear that would quicken them, but by the patience that would keep them true. And with each measured footfall, The world he had left grew quieter behind him, while the black land gathered its voice, preparing to speak in stone, in heat, and in a silence designed to be answered. The plain received him as if it had been waiting, and in a manner it had, for everything here was arranged to slow a mind that trusted speed, and to exhaust a heart that trusted certainty. The ash did not merely coat the ground. It breathed when the wind moved and settled when the wind slept, so that each step landed not on soil, but on the memory of fires. The sound of those steps became a lesson he returned to often, because in this land sound travels where sight cannot, and pace, more than path, decides whether a traveller is lost before he knows he has begun to wander. He let the stride that had carried him through green countries diminish into a steadier cadence, and he gave the earth permission to move without inviting it to speak. This discipline, modest to name and difficult to keep, reduced his presence to something smaller than a man and larger than a shadow, and that proportion, maintained hour by deliberate hour, allowed him to pass between the lines others could not even see. The watchers were real, and they were imagined, and the imagined were often the more dangerous. Real watchers sit in towers or along cut roads, and their duties grow predictable as boredom takes them. Imagined watchers are placed by fear in any dark that lies ahead, and they never tire of the shapes fear assigns them. Gandalf had trained himself across long years and many countries to separate the one kind from the other, without neglecting either. For neglect is how patrols are met by accident, and how courage breaks upon silhouettes drawn by a restless mind. He marked sightlines the way a river marks its banks, reading the angles that long stone ridges offered, and the bowls of shadow in which sound could be gathered and hidden. Where the ground seemed to persuade him toward a clean descent, he declined politely and chose instead the knotted way, because the enemy often trusts travellers to prefer ease and sets his nets accordingly. The plain, then the low swells, then the first black shelves of ancient lava. By degrees, the world closed around him. There were places where the ash lay thin and revealed a glassy crust beneath it, greenish and brown, as if frozen waves had been shorn of their crowns and left to harden into knives. He moved among these features as he would among a crowd, allowing space for each to keep its hostility to itself. When the crust flexed underfoot, it gave a note like a muted bell struck in a deep room. 3 such notes together would carry farther than the wind suggested, and he learned to prevent the second and the third. He learned, too, the correspondence of air and ground, because currents always accompany forms, and a change in one predicts a change in the other. The wind that moves down a long channel carries with it the scent of its origin, and from that scent a patient traveller may deduce whether stone lies ahead or water, and whether the water will be safe to touch or only to look upon. Water in Mordor bears study, not acquaintance. Streams appear where no sky should give them, and pools remain where no spring feeds them. And to bend over either is to feel the heat rise into the face like an answer to a question that was not asked. He kept to the margins where dampness had merely been suggested rather than achieved, and he took from his bag the measured rations he had prepared for such refusals. Thirst would be part of the journey, and so would hunger, not as enemies to be defeated with grand gestures, but as companions to be managed by quiet and by a schedule that did not negotiate. The fortress he approached loved to bargain, and it sets its first merchants on the road long before the gate is reached. The bargains begin with comfort and end with surrender. He recognized them as they came, and declined their wares without insult. Birds came, not in the cheerful flocks that had once used his staff as if it were a branch, but in pairs and sporadic trios, suspicious of height and certain of their work. They were not spies in the full sense. Mordor breeds vigilance more than subtlety. But they were trained by scarcity to notice what moved against the usual grain. Gandalf kept his line against the broken ground, and timed his pauses to coincide with their languid circles. There is a way to look at the sky that makes the sky look away, and he practiced it until the habit became something that moved without his consent. He kept his mind unclenched, because clenched minds attract attention, and he allowed the thought of Barad-dûr to recede each time it advanced uninvited, for to carry the tower within him would have been to announce his arrival before his feet had earned it. The secret of moving unseen lies less in cloaks and more in choices. He chose delay where delay would erase him, and chose commitment where hesitation would write him down. In the lee of a basalt fin, he waited while a file of orcs, lean and sullen, clattered past on a track hard enough to bear their iron. They did not sing, and did not speak beyond a growl when one stumbled. Their discipline was the discipline of fear, a narrow channel through which cruelty runs like a maintained stream. He watched them until their outlines lost coherence to distance, and only then did he continue. Not because he loved safety, but because he knew that every unnecessary risk indulged early would demand a debt at the threshold where debt is most costly. Night here is not altogether dark. The sky retains a reluctance to abandon its faint red, even when the sun is long gone, and the plain holds its heat like a lesson it is eager to repeat. He used that light as one uses memory, enough to avoid the worst of the jagged fields, not enough to justify haste. A few stars presented themselves above the clefts of cloud, and it took their presence as a courtesy rather than a promise, reading in their positions the broader tilt of the land, and confirming bearings that his feet had already begun to trust. When sleep must be won, it is won in increments, and the increments arrived as brief surrenders behind broken rocks, where wind had worried little nests of ash into corners. He did not lie fully. He allowed his body to suggest the posture, and allowed his mind to hover above it, so that waking, when it came, would not be a shock, but a small correction. By the second day within the ashlands, his clothing had accepted the color of the country, which is a protection finer than dyes. He ate at intervals set by his own time, rather than by the land's suggestions, because Mordor likes to tell you when to be hungry, and when to be tired, and obedience in such matters is a rehearsal for other obediences. He let the staff touch the ground with the indifference of a stick rather than the emphasis of a declaration. He never tapped, and he never used it to argue with stones. When heat thickened around him in sheets, he slowed, and allowed breath to become the craft it truly is, a braid of attention and patience that holds the self together, where the world would spread it thin. There were traces of older roads, not made by the enemy, but by the peoples who had once skirted this boundary, when the mountain had been only a mountain and not yet a throne. Their stones, sunken and half-devoured, still presented a logic of spacing that the newer works ignored. Gandalf used that logic as one uses an old proverb, aware that it may no longer govern, grateful that it still instructs. The spacing told him where packs would have shifted on shoulders, where caravans would have paused, where men had once chosen not to build because the ground beneath them would not keep faith. He followed that ghost of prudence until it broke against a fresh embankment of slag poured out by labourers who did not rest. Beyond that place, the land began to articulate its defences more plainly. Redoubts perched on dikes of vitrified earth. Narrow causeways ran between trenches whose edges smouldered with the residue of chemical fires. Cairns stood that were not memorials, but orders, telling those who could read them how to align their steps with the orders of the day. He read them without obeying, gleaning from their arrangements where eyes would linger, and where weariness would make those eyes lazy. He chose the routes that fell between habit and expectation, because expectation is where traps are placed, and habit is where sloppiness sets its camp. Twice he withdrew from lines he had already begun to trust, not because proof had arrived, but because the sum of small notices, the angle of a pike abandoned too neatly, the way dust settled against a low wall, converged into a caution too precise to ignore. He met no allies, and this was as intended. To move alone is to accept a simplicity that keeps kindness from becoming a liability. Yet he did not feel forsaken. He felt, rather, a thinning of everything that does not belong to the essential act. He recalled a snatch of laughter from a far inn, and let it pass without grasping, because holding such things too tightly can turn them brittle when they are needed later. Beneath the silence he had cultivated, a slow clarity was forming. Not about victory, which is a noisy idea, but about measure, which is quiet. He was beginning to measure the place in terms it respected: patience, repetition, refusal. If a lesson offended his pride, he made room for it anyway. And in that obedience he found the sort of freedom that Mordor does not recognize, and therefore cannot confiscate. Toward evening on the third day, he reached what cannot be named a border, so much as a decision the land had made about itself. The ridges gathered, their spines turning from random into pattern, and the gaps between them aligned like the teeth of keys that belong to a single lock. Smoke rose from vents in steady plumes rather than in gusts, and the heat shifted from accident to policy. Here the plain confessed its allegiance to the tower openly, and here the approaches that had tolerated improvisation began to insist on compliance. He adjusted again, as he had promised himself he would, and found a line that pressed left when the reasoning of the ridges suggested right. The leftward line grew ugly and small, and by that ugliness he knew it was correct. He passed near a station whose lamps were set not to illuminate, but to interrogate. Light in Mordor is posed as a question, with only one acceptable answer: submission. He let the beams swing across stone, and across the ash he had disturbed, and across his cloak's hem, where he had brushed it clean against a rock. When light reached his portion of the dark, there was not enough difference between the two to persuade it to linger. He continued as if no scrutiny had been offered, and in this way deprived the scrutiny of its favorite nutrient. Light, like hatred, overeats when resistance is too sharp. Starve it, and it grows careless. The last easy water lay behind him. Ahead, a black ribbon ran, neither fully liquid nor fully cooled, pulsing under a skin that pretended to be still. He skirted it at a distance, adequate to respect and inadequate to comfort. for distance itself is a language here, and one must not speak it too loudly. Where the ribbon narrowed, the land offered a causeway, apparently formed by chance. He distrusted chance of that scale, and delayed until the air moved just enough to carry sounds away. He crossed with the slowness of a scribe, drawing a letter that cannot be erased, and when a hard bubble broke beside his path, with a sound like a swallowed sob, he did not increase his pace. The patience that had served him in councils served him again, converting alarm into a steadying inventory. Heat, length, weight, consequence, end. On the far side, the features began to repeat in ways that were almost mathematical. Repetition is a comfort when it is honest, and a trap when it is staged, and he kept his mind from settling into rhythms that might be exploited. He let his memories of the wise return, one by one, not as a chorus, but as single notes to be held and released. Elrond's caution, Galadriel's clarity, even Saruman's polished skepticism. Each had a correct time to be remembered, and an incorrect time, and the correctness was decided by the angle of the next ridge, and by how much ash had collected in the crease of his sleeve. Serious matters do not suffer from being tested against small realities. He found that the small realities of Mordor were as bracing as any argument, and perhaps more sincere. There was a passable shelter in the lee of a tilted slab, and he allowed himself the luxury, if it can be called that, of closing his eyes fully for a span longer than a handful of breaths. In that quiet, he rehearsed again the refusal that had become the central fact of his journey. Refusal to dominate, refusal to answer force with the flavor of its own desire. Refusal to surrender his pace to the hunger of arriving. He considered how close he might be to the gaze that sought to draw all things into agreement with itself, and he steadied his thought against the possibility of being seen. The art of not calling attention is not entirely a bodily art. Thoughts, when sharpened excessively, glint like metal in torchlight. He dulled his edges without dulling his purpose, and when he opened his eyes, the world had not rearranged itself in his absence. When the ground rose again, it did so with intention. The ancient ramparts of the Efelduath loomed to his right as a promise of borders that this realm pretended to despise. The slag plains of Gorgoroth drew forward as if to enfold him, and ahead, beyond the arithmetic of ridges and vents, a smear of black stood taller than distance should allow. He did not name it. Not yet. Names are also signals, and he reserved the strongest of them for the moment when naming would serve rather than expose him. The smear brightened at the edges as if it had gathered the twilight into itself and squeezed it into significance. Even without acknowledging it, he felt the lightest tilting of the world toward a center of gravity that minds feel before bodies do. Signs of traffic increased, though the travelers themselves remained invisible. Grooves cut by wheels that knew their work, scuffs that said, "Here," a burden slipped and was shouldered again with anger. The subtle collapse of a berm, where a sentry had stood too long and redistributed his weight from one foot to the other. He read all this without romance and without disgust, converting the evidence into the next decision and the next. He wanted no trophies of perception and no praise from his own pride. Accuracy was sufficient, and in this place, extravagant. Night took him one more time before the threshold, and in that night a sound came from far away that might have been a signal, or might have been heat-escaping stone. He gave it equal faith in both directions, and altered nothing. Because to alter would have been to agree with one fear, rather than with the road. Sleep found him in fragments. Waking assembled him with the efficiency of a practiced hand. He ate what remained to be eaten, drank what could be spared, and rearranged his cloak so that the ash already upon it would look like ash newly acquired. To love neatness here is to lose sincerity. He left a shallow print of his rest that might be read as accident or as nothing at all. The day that brought him within reach of the outer watchers did not feel like arrival. It felt instead like the conclusion of a sentence whose grammar had been controlling his choices since the first mile. The air cooled without becoming kind. The light gathered without becoming generous. He saw, at last, structures that did not pretend to be natural. Pylons of iron set with sigils whose meaning was the same in every language. Submit, declare, be counted. He observed the sequence by which carts were admitted, and messengers queried, and foot patrols relieved, not in order to insert himself into that sequence, but in order to avoid it so carefully that avoidance looked like irrelevance. A ditch ran that did not claim to be a ditch. Its bottom hid old embers that flared, when fed and sulked when starved. He crossed it where a fallen spar had thrown a dry shadow across a width just large enough for one careful step, and then another. In making those steps, he discovered he had ceased to think in terms of anything beyond them, and rather than resist that focus, he chose to trust it, because one form of wisdom here is to be small enough to be faithful. Beyond the ditch the ground rose, and then withheld its summit for a little while, as if inviting the traveller to imagine what crest would reveal. He gave it no imaginings. He climbed, using the soft weight of his staff as counterpoise, and when at last the crest yielded, the world beyond it arranged itself into the approach he had known, without knowing, that he would find. Lines converged from distances that had feigned indifference. Towers stood with the arrogance of instruments, certain of their use, and between them the dark geometry of gates, multiple and layered, made clear that passage was not a matter of strength alone, but of consent taken by stages. He let himself look, because looking was owed, and when he had looked enough to equal the cost of arriving, he allowed the sight to loosen its hold. He stood, a moment only, in the shallow lee, where wind takes a breath before it is commanded to move again. The black tower did not present itself fully, not yet, but its nearness altered the meaning of every smaller thing, and in that alteration he felt the truth of all he had endured on the hidden road, that each restraint had been a preparation, each refusal a tool shaped against this hour. He adjusted the set of his cloak, as one might adjust a sentence before it is spoken, and invited his pulse to slow until it answered, without argument. Then he began the last movement across the ash toward the first of the thresholds, where stone ceases to be landscape and becomes a voice, and where even the smallest decision declares more than it intends. How does one approach a gate designed to hear intention before it hears footsteps? He would need to learn the answer in the act of entering, and he stepped forward to meet that lesson where it waited. The ground had carried him through silence and heat, through ash that remembered fire, and stone that remembered ruin, but now it delivered him to the place where silence became language. The threshold of Barad-dûr was not simply a gate of iron and stone, though such gates stood in cruel abundance. It was a boundary where the world itself altered, as if the very air had been taught to obey. Gandalf paused in the shallow lee of the last rise, and allowed the land to reveal its pattern. Towers stood at intervals that were not random, but rhythmic, as though arranged to bind the gaze into compliance. The gates themselves were layered, an outer barrier for the unworthy, an inner one for the permitted, and deeper still the final passage, sealed not by locks but by the will of the master who dwelt within. Even from here, before he had crossed the open approach, he felt that will, pressing outward, seeking to measure him, as if every stone demanded his declaration before it would allow him to take another step. He knew this demand was the true defense of the fortress. Armies could storm walls and lay waste to gates, but few could endure the invisible weight that pressed upon the heart, whispering that every step forward was already a confession of weakness. The nine had crossed these thresholds many times, their forms reinforced by the very shadow that dwelt here. Captains of orcs passed them under duress, sustained by fear that bound them more tightly than chains. But Gandalf came alone, bearing no ensign and no claim, and his task was not to conquer, but to withstand. His pace, measured and unhurried, was itself a form of defiance, for haste is the companion of fear, and fear was the welcome the fortress expected. He moved as if the gates were no more than markers upon a long road, significant but not supreme, and this indifference was both shield and challenge. The first sight of the battlements stirred in him, memories he did not welcome. He remembered the chronicles told in Rivendell of the last alliance, when Elendil and Gil-galad had marched upon this place in force. Then the gates had shuddered beneath the blows of countless armies, and the plains of Gorgoroth had run with smoke and fire until even the stones seemed weary of their labor. Yet the memory was not triumph, for he knew how narrowly victory had been grasped, and how it had slipped away in the single moment when the ring was claimed instead of destroyed. That memory hung upon the walls still, as though the fortress itself mocked the frailty of those who had thought to end it. Gandalf did not look away, but he carried the remembrance lightly, for to carry it too heavily would be to admit the fortress its victory over the present moment. The watchtowers leaned outward as if to study him, and though he knew they were staffed with eyes keen for intrusion, he felt more strongly the sense of being examined by something greater than mortal gaze. The eye was not visible, yet its attention threaded through stone and shadow alike, subtle as heat rising from iron. Gandalf steadied his breath and permitted himself no defensive thought, for defense can be read as concession. Instead, he held to the center of his mandate, that he was not here to overthrow, but to endure. The fortress sought to draw forth from him a declaration of his purpose, yet he withheld it, answering instead with patience. For patience is the one reply that cannot be twisted into submission. The gates loomed now before him, vast and cruelly adorned. Iron teeth jutted outward, symbols of possession etched deep into their surface, not meant to be read, but to be felt as weight upon the heart. They were closed, but not in the way a door is closed. They were closed as a question is closed, waiting for an answer it already believes it knows. Gandalf stood at their threshold and let the silence lengthen. In that lengthening, he felt the fortress testing him, urging him to speak, to knock, to name himself. Yet he did none of these things. He merely abided, and the air thickened around him, as though the tar itself grew restless in the absence of his declaration. At last a low groan moved through the gates, a sound like mountains shifting beneath the earth. Slowly they parted, not by mortal hand or visible mechanism, but by command of the will that ruled within. The passage opened as if to admit him, though no herald came forth, no guard issued challenge. It was invitation of the most perilous kind, for it implied recognition, that the one who approached was already accounted for in the fortress's design. To refuse the invitation would be to admit fear. To accept it would be to step into the very maw of domination. Gandalf stepped forward, not swiftly, but with the composure of one who had long since measured this cost. Inside, the threshold widened into a hall of shadow. Columns rose, vast and black, their surfaces polished to unnatural gleam, reflecting not light but a distortion of the shapes that stood before them. Here, architecture was theology. Every line bent toward subjugation. Every arch proclaimed the inevitability of surrender. The air was heavy, not with heat alone, but with the sense of voices speaking just beyond hearing, a chorus of will that sought to impress itself upon his own. Gandalf allowed the murmurs to pass through him without answering, as one allows the wind to pass without granting it dominion. He was not deaf to them, but he gave them no foothold. Each step deeper into the tower was both victory and peril. Victory, because he remained himself. Peril, because the tower would not accept neutrality for long. He knew that the heart of the fortress awaited him, where Sauron's presence was strongest, where the eye would not merely observe, but confront. Yet this was why he had come, to endure what could not be described from without, to test in himself the limits of resistance. He carried no weapon sharper than patience, no shield stronger than humility, and in these lay the strength the fortress least expected. Still, he could not deny the weight pressing down upon him. The columns seemed to lean closer as he passed. The floor beneath him throbbed as though it bore a pulse, and the darkness ahead was not absence, but density, a substance he must walk into rather than through. The tower itself was alive with Sauron's will, and it sought to shape him as clay is shaped by hands unseen. Yet he remembered Galadriel's counsel, the reminder that secrecy curdles when hoarded too long, and he knew that his presence here was not conquest, but witness. To endure was to speak truth, even if no word was uttered, and so he passed from threshold into chamber, from silence into confrontation. The fortress had admitted him, but what it demanded of him lay still ahead, waiting in the place where shadow gathers into voice and gaze. What would it mean to stand before that gaze and not be undone? He was about to learn. The hall narrowed as he moved deeper, though its narrowing was not of stone alone, but of presence, as if the space itself reshaped in response to him. The walls pressed inward without touching, and the air thickened as though it longed to take form, to wrap him in substance he could not resist. Ahead, the darkness was not merely absence of light, it was concentration, a point at which all the shadows of Mordor seemed to converge, waiting for him. Gandalf did not hasten, for he knew that to hurry was to reveal fear, and fear was the very key this place sought. Each step was a measured declaration of endurance, each breath an act of quiet defiance, until the chamber at last opened before him. It was vast, yet the vastness was deceptive, for the eye filled it without being seen. No figure greeted him, No throne was occupied by a form of flesh and armor. Instead, the chamber vibrated with a presence that was both everywhere and nowhere, as though the air itself had been bent into a single gaze. The eye of Sauron did not appear in flame, as it would later blaze upon the tower's pinnacle. But it was here nonetheless, not as fire, but as gravity. Gandalf felt it settle upon him like a weight that could pierce bone, a scrutiny that sought not his body, but the shape of his will. The voice followed, though it was not sound. It moved within him rather than upon him, shaping thoughts into syllables that did not belong to him. It asked nothing at first. It only named, names of power, names of places long lost, names he had carried within him since his first arrival in Middle-earth. Each name was spoken as if to prove that nothing remained hidden, that every path he had walked was already inscribed in the enemy's ledger. To this litany, Gandalf answered with silence. For silence, too, can be an answer. The voice pressed harder, shaping questions disguised as statements, urging him to confess intention, to reveal what errand had brought him here alone. Still he refused, his will holding to the center that had guided him. He was not here to declare, but to endure. The chamber shifted in response. The columns swayed like trees in a storm, though they were stone. The floor pulsed with heat, though no fire burned beneath it. The presence grew sharper, testing him not with direct command, but with insinuation. Promises shimmered at the edges of thought, strength to overthrow armies, wisdom to guide nations, the end of wandering loneliness. These were not lies in themselves, but truths turned poisonous, for each gift was twisted by the hand that offered it. Gandalf recognized them as snares laid not upon his mind, but upon his mandate. To accept any would be to break the covenant that bound him, to fall into the same corruption that had claimed Saruman in secret. So he bore them, not dismissing them with pride, but letting them pass as one lets storm winds pass over a mountain. Time did not flow in this chamber. Minutes stretched into eternities, and eternities compressed into single breaths. Gandalf felt the eye turn from temptation to accusation, and the questions sharpened. Why resist when resistance would fail? Why suffer the weight of lesser peoples when mastery could bring order? Why cling to humility when even humility was seen, measured, and mocked? These questions were not mere words. They were blades honed to cut away the scaffolding of his resolve. Yet Gandalf remembered the smallest things, the laughter of hobbits in a green field, the stubborn kindness of strangers, the resilience of lives that seemed too ordinary to matter. Against the weight of the eye, he set these memories like pebbles against a tide, and though small, they anchored him. The silence he held was not emptiness, but fullness, a silence woven of refusal and patience. He did not argue, for argument acknowledges authority. He did not boast, for boasting feeds the gaze it seeks to defy. Instead he became stillness, a vessel that could not be shaped, because it had already chosen its form. The eye pressed harder, the chamber throbbed with tension, but no declaration was drawn from him. At length, the presence shifted, its intensity receding not in defeat, but in acknowledgement. The silence had been heard, and though it had not been broken, it had spoken. When the pressure eased, the chamber seemed larger, as though it exhaled. The voice receded into shadow, leaving behind only the lingering certainty that this contest was not concluded, only postponed. Gandalf stood, unchanged in form, yet heavier in spirit, knowing that endurance itself carried a cost. The silence he had offered was a wound now born within him, for to resist such weight was to bend nearly to breaking. But he had not broken, and that fact alone would echo beyond this chamber, shaping choices he had yet to make. He turned at last, the way behind him now more daunting than it had been before, for leaving a place of shadow often demands more courage than entering it. The fortress did not resist his departure. It allowed him to go as if confident that no departure could truly free him from its gaze. And perhaps it was right, for Gandalf knew that what he had faced here would walk with him long after his steps had left the stone behind. The tower had measured him, and he had withstood the measure, but the price of that defiance had only begun to reveal itself. He stepped back through the echoing hall into corridors where shadows thinned but did not vanish, and the question grew quietly in his mind. What weight had he carried out with him, unseen, yet enduring? And how would it shape the choices that still lay before him? The air outside the chamber of Barad-dûr felt different, though it had not changed in substance. It was still the dry, stifling weight of Gorgoroth, still thick with heat and oppressive in its stillness. Yet, for Gandalf, it carried a new sense, a residual echo of the presence he had just withstood. There were no immediate signs of pursuit, no cries or heavy steps that would betray the shadow he had left behind, but the land itself seemed altered now, like a watchful eye that does not blink. The absence of sound was not peaceful, but full of tension, the kind that comes before the world shifts, before a storm begins to gather in the distance. He moved steadily, but the weight of the journey began to settle more heavily upon him. It was not fatigue, but something deeper, something that had followed him through the gates, unseen, but present. The tower had not offered him answers, but it had offered him clarity, clarity that came with a cost. Every choice made in the face of such an overwhelming presence carries ripples that stretch far beyond the moment. Gandalf was beginning to understand that the true test had only just begun, and what lay ahead was more than the mere crossing of terrain. He had entered a place of no return. Whatever forces had measured him within those walls would follow him, and there was no place in Middle-earth where he could lay down the burden of that encounter. The path out of Mordor was not long, yet it seemed endless. The very ground seemed to shift with each step, as though the land itself was unwilling to release him. The air grew heavier the further he moved from the tower, as if its gravity was pulling at him, urging him back to its heart, to the point where he could finally give in to its will. Gandalf had once believed that distance from a threat was a form of safety, but now he understood that the true danger was not behind him, but within. He carried the weight of the eye, of that gaze that saw into his heart, and though he had not bent under its pressure, its presence would remain with him. He paused for a moment, resting against a jagged stone that jutted from the earth like a remnant of some forgotten battle. The stone was warm to the touch, as if it still remembered the fires of a time long past. His mind lingered on the conversation within the tower, the words that had been spoken in shadow, the questions that had been asked of him. There was no time for reflection in a place such as this. Mordor had no room for pauses, but he allowed himself this one moment, for it was clear to him now that the path forward would demand every ounce of his strength, and more. As the hours passed, the land began to take on a different quality. The blackened plains gave way to the harder, jagged hills that marked the approach to the Dûr. The ash beneath his boots grew thinner, and the air, while still hot, became less suffocating. Yet even this change was illusory, for the land beyond was not any less hostile. In fact, the transition from Mordor's heart to the outer lands was like crossing from one kind of prison into another. Less immediately oppressive, perhaps, but no less dangerous. Gandalf knew that the land outside of Barad-dûr held its own threats, its own trials, though they would be more insidious, more subtle. His thoughts returned again to the eye, and the realization struck him with a quiet force. The tower had been more than a place. It had been a reflection, a mirror of all that Sauron sought to impose upon the world. Its influence had not left him, and it would not leave him. No matter where he traveled now, that weight, that gaze, would follow him. There were no true escapes from such a confrontation. But the journey was not over, and Gandalf could not afford the luxury of self-reflection for long. He could not afford to linger on the toll it had taken on him, for there were others in Middle-earth who needed him. The need for resistance, for hope, did not end when he left the tower. It only began. The road ahead, winding through the foothills of the Dûr, would lead him eventually to the borders of Gondor. But Gandalf knew that the physical distance between him and Barad-dûr would mean little in the long run. No matter how far he traveled, the shadows of Mordor had already begun to stretch into the world, and his choices, made in that chamber of stone and fire, had set in motion forces that would play out across the lands of Middle-earth. The war was not simply one of armies and kings. It was a war of wills, of souls, of resistance, and Gandalf had set himself upon the path of resistance once more. The tension that had settled upon him did not dissipate as the land grew quieter, nor did the creeping sense of being watched fade with each step. Instead, he walked forward with a new kind of resolve, one forged not in the certainty of victory, but in the understanding that resistance in itself was a victory that could never be measured in terms of triumph, but only in endurance. It was a victory that would be seen not in the number of battles won or lost, but in the quiet refusal to surrender that defined the struggle. Gandalf's path through the land of Mordor was just one chapter in a much longer story, a story that stretched far beyond the confines of the Black Land and into the hearts of those who would, in time, rise to stand against Sauron's forces. The battle had begun, and though Gandalf had played his part in it, his journey was far from over. The land before him seemed to open up, not in welcome, but in challenge. Each step took him deeper into the heart of darkness, but each step also brought him closer to the light of those he sought to protect, those whose courage would, in the end, be the true weapon against the coming storm. As he continued onward, there was no question of turning back. The darkness of Mordor had already reached him, and no amount of distance could change that. But what mattered now was how he chose to carry that darkness, how he would walk with it and use it to light the way for others. It was not the eye of Sauron that would define him, but his refusal to let it define the world. And so he walked, not as one defeated, but as one who had already chosen the only victory that mattered, to endure. In that quiet resolve, Gandalf knew the true weight of the road ahead was not measured in miles, but in the choices made along the way. Every step was a step further from the shadow of Barad-dûr, and yet every step was also a step toward the inevitable confrontation that would come once again. And though the weight of that confrontation pressed upon him like the heat of the land beneath his feet, he walked forward with a calm that could not be shaken, for he knew that this was the path of resistance, and that in the end, resistance would be the only thing that could hold back the shadow. The road from Mordor, though now behind him, still seemed to pulse beneath his feet, as if the very earth carried the weight of what had occurred within the walls of Barad-dûr. Gandalf moved steadily, his cloak drawn close to his form, though he was no longer certain whether it was to shield him from the land, or to shield the land from him. The weight of what he had encountered there, Sauron's will made manifest in the form of an unyielding gaze, pressed upon him more heavily now than it had before. The eye had not simply measured him, it had branded him with a truth too heavy to bear, without a reckoning. Yet he had withstood, and for that he was unchanged, yet not unchanged. The land around him began to shift subtly, imperceptibly at first, but in a way that made every step seem more deliberate, more significant. It was no longer just the ashen plains of Gorgoroth that surrounded him. The land now bore the scars of Sauron's influence, but it was not broken by it. Merely marked, the hills rose before him, jagged and sharp, like a slumbering beast waiting for the chance to stir. The air grew colder, more biting, though there was no wind to speak of. It was as though the land itself had begun to harden in response to the presence of the Dark Lord, to insulate itself from the forces that had shaped it. Gandalf walked on, feeling the silence close in around him. No birds flew overhead, no rustle of wind disturbed the quiet. The absence of life, no matter how expected in such a land, felt unnatural. He had walked through many desolate places, but this silence, this complete stillness, was something else entirely. It was not peace. It was the absence of peace, the emptiness that follows in the wake of great destruction. But Gandalf did not allow himself to dwell too deeply on this feeling. His task had always been to endure, not to break under the weight of despair. And so he walked, step by measured step, moving forward toward the next challenge he would face. The cold began to bite more sharply as night fell. Gandalf knew that rest would be necessary, yet he dared not find comfort in a land that seemed so eager to claim him. There were places where the earth itself seemed to breathe, to pulse with the quiet, unseen force that sought to test him. There was no turning back now. He had passed through Barad-dûr, and though he had emerged physically unscathed, he knew that the true weight of what he had endured was far from over. As he moved deeper into the land, he could not shake the feeling that he was being followed, not in the sense that he was being hunted, but in the way that a shadow follows the one it trails. He had felt it before, when he first approached the Black Tower, but now it seemed more pressing. It was not a physical presence, but a creeping awareness, something that weighed upon him not from behind, but from within. Was it the eye itself, lingering in his thoughts, or was it something else? The realization was unsettling, but he would not let it consume him. If he had learned anything from his time in Mordor, it was that fear only had power when it was allowed to grow unchecked. The hills ahead seemed to rise even more steeply as he approached them, their rocky faces now jagged and broken. They loomed ahead like ancient sentinels, standing guard over something that Gandalf could not yet see. It was a place where light seemed reluctant to fall, as though the earth itself absorbed it, leaving only dim shadows in its wake. Here, in this twilight gloom, Gandalf had to resist the pull to quicken his pace. The ground beneath his feet seemed to demand more care now. Every step felt like a decision, every shift in his weight a challenge to remain steady, to keep moving forward, even when the land itself seemed intent on slowing him down. As the hours stretched on, the kindness of darkness began to close in. The stars above were barely visible, obscured by the lingering clouds that stretched out over the land. Gandalf knew the wilderness he moved through was not uninhabited. He could feel the eyes of creatures, not seen, but sensed, tracking his every movement. His mind flickered back to the chamber of Barad-dûr, to the pressure of the eye that had been so keen on him, so insistent. He was not yet free from that gaze, and the thought stirred in him a quiet unease. But he would not allow himself to falter. He had made it past the gates, past the direct confrontation, and now he would carry on. The road ahead was long, and the danger still lay in the lands beyond, but Gandalf would not turn from it. Not now, not after everything he had faced. As the landscape grew more treacherous, the passage through the hills narrowing with each turn, Gandalf felt the weight of solitude settle in around him. He had always moved alone in the service of the greater task, but now the burden of that solitude felt more profound. The others, those who had looked to him for guidance, were not here. He had no allies at his side, no companions to lighten the load. In that moment, he felt the true isolation of his mission. It was a solitary road, one that required a strength few could understand, a commitment to something beyond the moment. He could not help but wonder, how long could he carry this weight? How long could anyone? His thoughts darkened briefly, but he shook them off. To dwell on such questions now would be to give in to the very doubt that had tested him in Mordor. He had already endured. He would continue to endure. There was no other choice. In the distance, the hills began to flatten out, and the land stretched open before him. He knew that the dangers ahead would be different from those he had just faced. The land of Gondor was not far, but it was not a safe place either. The shadows of Sauron reached into every corner of Middle-earth, and though the war had not yet reached its climax, its presence was already felt in the winds that stirred the fields, in the very air that hung heavy with foreboding. Gandalf quickened his pace, not out of fear, but because he knew what waited for him in the distance. And yet, even as he moved with purpose, there was a part of him that could not help but look back at the land he had crossed. The shadows of Mordor still seemed to linger, like a dark stain upon the fabric of the world, and it was unclear whether the land could ever truly be free of them. But there was no time to ponder that now. There were choices to be made, and he would make them as he had made every other decision in this long journey, with careful thought and unwavering resolve. The landscape ahead opened further, revealing the first signs of the lands he had crossed in his earlier days of wandering. The familiar contours of Middle-earth began to emerge, but so too did the signs of war. Broken fields, the remnants of villages that had once stood proud, and fires still burning on the horizon. Gandalf knew that the war was already shaping these lands, that the world was moving toward a great reckoning. Yet he also knew that the heart of that reckoning lay not in the armies that would march, nor in the kings and warriors who would rise to defend their homes. It lay in the hearts of those who were willing to stand against the darkness, who were willing to endure even when the world seemed lost. His path was clear now. The choices that lay ahead would define not only his own fate, but the fate of all who had placed their trust in him. He would walk the road of resistance, not as a leader, but as a servant to those who believed in the light that could still be found in the world. And though the road ahead was uncertain, one thing was sure: he would not falter. Not again. And with that certainty, Gandalf continued on, the weight of his journey and his purpose pressing forward with each step, knowing that this was the only way forward: to endure, to resist, and to remain steadfast in the face of all that would seek to bring him down. The land before him stretched wide and unforgiving, but as Gandalf moved through it, there was something undeniably different in the air. The weight of Mordor, though still clinging to his mind, was fading, but its echo lingered in the very earth beneath his feet, like the faint reverberation of a storm long past. The road ahead was no less daunting than the one behind. It was simply different in its challenge. The mountains, the ash, the suffocating heat, they were all tangible, visceral, and immediate threats. But here, where the land opened up into the rolling plains leading into Gondor's borders, the danger felt more insidious. It was in the silence that pressed down upon him, in the absence of movement, in the stillness of a world that seemed to hold its breath. Every step he took now felt heavier, not in body, but in spirit. The journey to Barad-dûr had been a test of endurance, a test of will in the face of overwhelming power. But this was something else entirely. It was a test of resolve, a test of his ability to continue, to press forward when the very ground seemed to resist him, to move forward when every part of him screamed to stop and reflect. The weight of the decision he had made, of the course he had set upon, was growing clearer with each passing day. Gandalf was no stranger to hardship. It was the nature of his work to stand alone, to endure, to guide others through darkness. But this weight was different. It was not just his own, but that of all those who depended on him, who looked to him for guidance. The stakes were higher now. The end game was near. He had crossed into the lands of Gondor, but the road here was not one of warmth or refuge. It was a road scarred by conflict, marked by the imprints of battles that had been fought and lost. The fields were not lush and green as they once might have been, but worn and battered, as though even the earth itself was grieving the war that had taken hold. The smoke rising from the distant cities spoke of the tension that permeated the air. Gondor was in turmoil, its defenses stretched thin, its people weary from years of conflict. Gandalf knew that his arrival here would not bring an immediate resolution to the troubles of the realm. It was a realm that had been tested by fire, and its flame was burning low. The silence around him grew more oppressive as he made his way toward Minas Tirith. The roads had once been filled with the bustle of merchants and travelers, but now they were empty, save for the occasional soldier marching toward an unknown destination. The lands had become a place of waiting, a place where the future felt uncertain, and the present was one of quiet desperation. Gandalf could feel the weight of that uncertainty pressing in on him, threatening to suffocate him. And yet, as much as he wanted to allow himself the luxury of doubt, he could not. The mission had not changed. The need for action had not waned. The only thing that had changed was the scale of the task before him. As the evening drew near, Gandalf could see the silhouette of Minas Tirith rising in the distance, its white stone gleaming against the darkening sky. The city was a beacon of hope, a symbol of the resilience of the people of Gondor. But even from this distance, he could see the cracks in its armor, the weariness in its walls. The fortress that had once stood as a proud guardian of the realm now seemed to be bowing beneath the weight of years, of battles, of siege. The shadow of Sauron was long, and it stretched out across the land, pressing against the heart of the city itself. Gandalf could not help but wonder how much longer Gondor could stand under this pressure. How much longer could its people endure, knowing that the very land they fought for was slowly being swallowed by the darkness? And yet, as much as he wanted to yield to the weight of these questions, he knew that there was no time for such reflection. There was only one thing that mattered now: to reach the city, to find the council of those who still held power, and to prepare for what was coming. The battle was not over. It had not even truly begun. As he approached the gates of Minas Tirith, he was met with a small group of guards, their expressions wary but respectful. They had seen many travelers pass through their gates, but few had come with the purpose that Gandalf did. His reputation had preceded him, and even in the shadow of Sauron's power, the people of Gondor still held to the hope that he would be the one to lead them to victory. But Gandalf could see the doubt in their eyes, the fear that lingered beneath their stoic expressions. They did not believe in victory, not yet. And who could blame them? The battle was not one that could be won by strength alone. It would take more than swords and shields to defeat Sauron's will. The guards ushered him through the gates, and as he stepped into the city, he could feel the weight of its history pressing upon him. Minas Tirith had stood through centuries of war, had weathered countless sieges, and yet it still stood. But at what cost? What had been sacrificed in the name of resistance? What hope remained in the hearts of the people who called this place home? Gandalf made his way through the winding streets, his mind racing with the knowledge of what he had to do. There were still many decisions to be made, many roads to be walked. But one thing was certain: he could not let Gondor fall. The city, though weary, was still a symbol of defiance, and it would remain standing as long as there were those who were willing to fight for it. His thoughts were interrupted as he arrived at the Hall of the Kings, where the Council of Gondor had gathered. Inside, the air was thick with tension as the leaders of the city debated their next steps. The steward, Denethor, stood at the head of the council, his face drawn and weary, as though the weight of the realm had crushed him long ago. Gandalf could see the strain in his eyes, the fear that had taken root in his heart. Denethor was a man who had long held power, but now, as the shadow of Sauron loomed closer, he was beginning to crumble beneath it. Gandalf knew that his role in this meeting would not be to command, but to guide. He had come not to dictate terms, but to offer wisdom, to remind them of the strength that still lay within them. There was hope in Gondor, though it was fragile. But in order for that hope to survive, the people of Gondor would have to believe in themselves once more. The council, once a place of unity, now seemed to be divided, with each leader calling for different measures. Some wanted to strike out, to take the fight to Sauron's forces before they could gather strength. Others, more cautious, advocated for a defense of the city, to prepare for the inevitable siege. Gandalf listened to their arguments, his mind working swiftly, weighing the risks, the costs, and the benefits. It was not a simple decision. There were no clear answers, no guarantees that any path would lead to victory. But one thing was certain: they could not wait. They could not afford to allow Sauron's forces to continue unchallenged. The time for hesitation had passed. At last, Gandalf spoke, his voice cutting through the noise of the council. "You cannot wait any longer," he said. "The shadow of Mordor has already reached this city, and it will not be satisfied until it has consumed all that you hold dear. You must act, and you must act now. There is no time for further debate." Denethor's gaze flickered over to Gandalf, his expression unreadable. "And what do you propose we do?" he asked, his voice strained. Gandalf met his gaze steadily. "We will gather what forces we can, and hold the city. We will not allow Mordor to take this land without a fight. We will fight for Gondor, for all of Middle-earth. But you must trust in your people. You must remind them that they have something worth fighting for." There was a long silence, and Gandalf felt the weight of the moment press upon him. But then, one by one, the members of the council nodded in agreement. They knew, deep down, that Gandalf was right. There was no other choice. The battle would come, whether they were ready or not, and they could not afford to wait any longer. And so, the decision was made. The forces of Gondor would stand and fight. There was no guarantee of victory, but there was hope, and that hope would be the strength they needed to endure whatever came next. As Gandalf left the council hall, he could feel the weight of the decision settle within him. The road ahead was fraught with danger, but for the first time in a long while, he felt a glimmer of hope. It was small, fragile, but it was enough. The people of Gondor would fight, and that was the only thing that truly mattered. The battle was coming, and he would stand with them. The decision had been made, but the weight of it did not lift as Gandalf walked out into the cool night air of Minas Tirith. The city, though ancient and proud, was battered and worn, its defenses strained by the continuous threat from Mordor. Yet there was a palpable sense of resolve among the people, a quiet determination that now seeped into the streets like the evening fog. It was as though they had all been waiting for something, someone, to ignite the flame of resistance once more. Now that Gandalf had spoken, now that the council had given its reluctant agreement, the city was no longer a place of waiting. It was a place of action. He moved through the streets of Gondor, passing by soldiers preparing for battle, their faces hardened with the knowledge of what lay ahead. Even the air itself felt tense, as if the city had drawn a deep breath, holding it in anticipation. But Gandalf could not afford to linger in this moment of fragile hope. His mind was already elsewhere, back on the road ahead, back on the battle that was yet to come. The forces of Sauron were massing, and though Minas Tirith's walls stood tall and the city was well defended, the sense of impending doom was inescapable. It was as if the very earth itself trembled at the thought of what was to come. Gandalf knew that the battle for Gondor was only the beginning. The fate of Middle-earth was being decided here, in this moment. and they were about to face their darkest hour. But he also knew that there was no other path for them. They could not bow before the darkness, not now. The time for hiding had passed. The moon hung low in the sky, casting a pale light over the city's walls. Gandalf felt the weight of the hours pressing upon him, the responsibility of leadership sinking deeper into his bones. He had spoken with the authority of wisdom and experience. But even now, as the night crept on, there was still a nagging doubt. Could they hold? Could Gondor withstand the full force of Sauron's might? And if they couldn't, what then? As the sound of marching feet echoed through the city streets, Gandalf's mind turned to the other members of the council, to those whose voices had been quieter in the debate. Faramir, the steward's son, had shown courage, but he had also shown restraint. He had understood the gravity of Gandalf's words, but would he act with the same resolve when the battle came to their doorstep? Would the people of Gondor rise up, or would fear cause them to falter at the moment they needed courage the most? Gandalf's thoughts were interrupted by the sound of a distant horn. A signal from the battlements. His heart skipped a beat. It was time. The enemy was approaching, and the final defense of Gondor was about to begin. He quickened his pace, moving toward the central citadel, where the leaders of Gondor were gathering. The courtyard was filled with the sound of commanders giving orders, the clatter of armor being donned, and the murmurs of soldiers preparing themselves for the battle that was only moments away. Gandalf moved through the ranks, his presence almost unnoticed among the men who had seen countless battles. But there was a change in the air. His arrival seemed to stir something in the soldiers, a reminder of the hope that had been ignited with his words. He found himself standing beside Faramir, who was overseeing the final preparations. The younger man's face was grim, but there was a fire in his eyes. Gandalf could see that the responsibility of command weighed heavily on him, but he also saw the determination in Faramir's posture. The son of Denethor had taken his father's burden without hesitation, without complaint. And now, with the dawn of war upon them, he was ready to lead. "It is time," Gandalf said, his voice steady, though he felt the tightness in his chest. He looked out across the battlefield that stretched out before them, the fields and hillsides that would soon be consumed by the march of war. The armies of Sauron were coming. They were already on the move, and there was no time to waste. Faramir nodded in silent acknowledgement, and together they turned to face the battlefield. The first line of defense was ready, their shields raised high, their spears fixed in unyielding formation. Behind them, the city walls loomed, offering what protection they could, but Gandalf knew that it was not enough. The power of Sauron was too great, and the armies he commanded too numerous. There was no way to fight him with strength alone. They would need more than swords and shields. As the first wave of enemies approached, Gandalf's mind raced through the strategies they had discussed. He had always believed that there was more to war than just battle tactics. There was a deeper strategy at play, one that involved understanding not just the enemy's strength, but the weakness that lay beneath it. It was not enough to withstand the tide of Sauron's forces. They had to give the people of Gondor something to fight for, something beyond the walls of their city and the weight of their fathers' legacies. They had to make the battle their own. Faramir turned to Gandalf, his voice steady but filled with urgency. "What now?" Gandalf met his gaze, and in that moment, the weight of everything they had discussed, everything they had planned, became clear. "Now, we show them what it means to fight for something greater than ourselves. We fight not just for Gondor, but for all of Middle-earth. We fight for the light that still remains." Faramir nodded again, and with a final glance toward the city's defenders, he turned to lead his men to the front lines. Gandalf watched him go, his heart swelling with pride. Faramir was ready. He was more than ready. As the battle began to unfold, Gandalf felt the shift in the air, felt the first stirrings of something ancient and powerful awakening within the hearts of the people of Gondor. They were no longer just defending their homes. They were defending everything they stood for, everything they had ever believed in. The shadow that loomed over the land could not take that from them, not without a fight. The enemy's first wave crashed against the city's defenses, but it was not an overwhelming force. The soldiers of Gondor fought back with a ferocity that surprised even Gandalf. The wall held, the shield of men stood firm, and for a moment it seemed as though the tide might turn in their favor. The battle was fierce, but for now the defenders held their ground. Gandalf's thoughts raced forward, beyond this first assault. He knew that the true test would come later, when the enemy pressed harder, when the walls were tested by the full might of Sauron's legions. But for now, in this moment, he allowed himself the briefest flicker of hope. The people of Gondor were fighting. They were ready. They were not yet broken. As the battle raged on, Gandalf found himself standing among the soldiers, his staff in hand, a symbol of resistance amidst the chaos. He could feel the power of the moment, the collective will of those around him, rising to meet the challenge. This was not just a battle for survival. It was a battle for the soul of Middle-earth. And though the night would stretch long, and the forces of darkness would press relentlessly, Gandalf knew that there was something here that could not be quenched, something that could still burn brightly in the face of despair. That something was the courage to stand, to fight, and to endure. As the first light of dawn began to break over the horizon, the battle reached its height. Gandalf raised his staff high, drawing upon the last of his strength, calling forth the ancient powers that lay hidden within the earth. He knew that the battle for Gondor was far from over, but as long as they could stand together, there was hope. And that hope was a weapon stronger than any army. The first light of dawn cast a soft glow over the battlefield, but it did little to dispel the oppressive weight of the moment. Gandalf stood among the defenders of Minas Tirith, his heart heavy with the knowledge that the true battle had only just begun. The sounds of conflict filled the air, the clash of steel on steel, the cries of men, and the screeches of the orcs as they pressed relentlessly against the city's defenses. The ground beneath him trembled with each wave of the enemy, and the city's ancient walls, though strong, seemed to groan under the weight of the assault. Gandalf's eyes swept over the field. The defenders were holding, but he could feel the strain in their movements, the fatigue in their eyes. They had been pushed to the edge, and though they fought with the courage of desperation, it would not be enough for long. Even the greatest fortress in Middle-earth could only withstand so much. The enemy was vast, their numbers seemingly endless, but the forces of Gondor had something the orcs did not: hope. A glimmer of it, yes, but it was there. The fire of resistance, the refusal to give in, burned in the hearts of the people. That, Gandalf knew, could turn the tide. He turned toward the city's inner courtyard, where Faramir was overseeing the reinforcements being sent to the front lines. The young captain's face was grim but resolute, his leadership unwavering in the face of disaster. Gandalf had seen many men in his time, men of courage and men of cowardice, but there was something about Faramir. He was a man forged in the crucible of war, tempered by loss, yet unwilling to allow that loss to define him. "Faramir," Gandalf called, his voice steady despite the chaos that surrounded them. The captain turned to face him, his expression weary but determined. "We hold, for now," he said, his voice low. "But I do not know how much longer we can last. The enemy is relentless, and our forces are thinning. We need more time, but I fear time is running out." Gandalf nodded, his eyes scanning the battlefield again. "We will buy time," he said. "We must." Faramir's brow furrowed, as if weighing the cost of what that would require. "How?" "By reminding them of what they fight for," Gandalf replied. "There is power in defiance, Faramir. You have seen it in your soldiers. Now we must remind them that this is not just a fight for survival. It is a fight for everything they hold dear." Faramir looked as though he might protest, but Gandalf held up a hand to silence him. "I have seen the light in their eyes. It is not extinguished yet, but we must act now before it fades." Without another word, Faramir nodded and turned to rally his men. Gandalf felt a flicker of hope stir within him. He had seen countless battles, and while victory was never guaranteed, he knew that the fight for Gondor was not yet lost. The people had strength still, and he would see that strength harnessed, even if it meant calling upon every last ounce of his own power. He stepped forward, moving toward the front lines where the battle raged fiercest. The orcs, though numerous and brutal, were not invincible. They lacked the resolve of the men of Gondor, and that was their greatest weakness. Gandalf had always known that the strength of any army was not just in its weapons or its numbers, but in its will. And here, in the heart of Minas Tirith, that will was still unbroken. As he approached the walls, he raised his staff high, calling upon the ancient powers that had always flowed beneath the surface of Middle-earth. His voice rang out, quiet but filled with the force of 1,000 years of wisdom. The ground trembled beneath him, and a soft glow emanated from his staff, brightening the gloom of battle. The soldiers fighting at the walls paused, sensing the change in the air, and a murmur spread among them. For a moment it was as though the world held its breath. The orcs, too, seemed to falter, uncertain, as though they had been caught off guard by the sudden surge of power. It was a brief moment, but it was enough. Gandalf's presence was not just an act of leadership. It was a reminder of the ancient forces that had shaped Middle-earth, forces that would not stand idly by while darkness sought to consume it. "Gondor does not fall today," Gandalf's voice rang out over the battlefield, amplified by the power of his staff. "The light of the free peoples will not be extinguished. Stand firm, all who fight for freedom." His words echoed across the field, and something in the soldiers shifted. It was subtle at first, an imperceptible change in posture, in the way they held their swords, but it was there. The fire of resistance, once flickering, now burned brighter. Gandalf could feel it, the surge of hope that rose in the hearts of those who still had something to protect. It was not a great surge, not yet, but it was enough. The orcs, though numerous, had no answer to this. Their strength lay in their overwhelming numbers, in their ability to wear down their enemies with sheer force. But they could not break the will of a people who had something to fight for. Gandalf could feel the tide of the battle shifting, just a little. But enough. The soldiers of Gondor, seeing the light of hope rekindled, pressed forward with renewed vigor. They fought not just to defend their city, but to preserve everything they held dear, everything that had been threatened by the darkness of Sauron's forces. The battle raged on, the clang of steel and the roar of battle rising to a deafening crescendo. Gandalf moved among the soldiers, his staff raised high, his presence a symbol of the strength that still remained in Gondor. He did not lead with the sword, but with his will, with the power of the ancient magic that had been granted to him. His heart was steady, though his mind was always calculating the next move, the next strategy, for he knew that this battle was far from over. Hours passed, but the tide of the battle did not shift dramatically. It was a war of attrition, a war of wills, and as the day wore on, Gandalf could feel the strain of it. But the soldiers of Gondor were still holding. The walls had not been breached, and though the orcs were relentless, they could not crack the resolve of the defenders. Gandalf could see Faramir, leading his men from the front, rallying them as they fought. The young captain was a beacon of hope amidst the chaos, his determination unyielding. Gandalf could see the spark in his eyes, the same spark that had been there when he first met him, the spark of leadership that refused to be extinguished. He knew then that Gondor was not lost. Not yet. But as the sun began to set, casting long shadows over the battlefield, Gandalf felt a cold dread creep up his spine. The forces of Sauron had not yet revealed their full strength, and though the men of Gondor were holding their own, there was still the looming threat of the darkness that would soon descend upon them. The battle was far from over, and he could not afford to believe that victory was certain. Every moment counted. He raised his staff once more, calling upon the powers that still lay dormant within the earth. This was not the time for recklessness. This was the time for strategy, for cunning. And as the night began to fall, Gandalf knew that the next phase of the battle would require every ounce of his strength, every scrap of wisdom he had gained in his long years of service to Middle-earth. The light of the city flickered against the oncoming dark, but Gandalf would not let it be extinguished. Not today. Not while there was still breath in his body and fire in the hearts of the defenders. The battle was still in play, and Gandalf would fight until the very last moment to ensure that Gondor and Middle-earth itself would not fall to the shadow. The forces of Sauron were vast, their might seemingly unending, but Gandalf knew that the greatest strength was not in numbers, but in resolve. And he would hold that resolve, as would those who fought beside him. This battle would not end with the breaking of Gondor, not as long as there were those who could stand and fight. The light of resistance would burn through the dark. It had to. The night descended heavily upon Minas Tirith, cloaking the battlefield in shadows that seemed to grow thicker with each passing moment. The roar of the clash between Gondor's defenders and the dark forces of Sauron echoed across the plains, a constant rhythm of destruction, but also defiance. The first wave of assault had been held, but Gandalf knew it was only a temporary reprieve. The battle was far from over. The air was thick with the stench of smoke, blood, and iron, and though the defenders fought valiantly, there was something about the weight of this night that made it feel like a beginning, not an end. Gandalf stood at the city's edge, watching the ebb and flow of battle. His staff was firmly planted in the ground beside him, a silent reminder of the ancient power that had sustained him through countless trials. The city walls were still standing, but they were battered, their foundations tested. The forces of Mordor pressed forward relentlessly, pushing against the gates, hammering against the defenses with an energy born from a singular purpose: to consume. But Gondor was not alone. The armies of men fought with a ferocity Gandalf had not seen in years. There was a fire in their hearts, a spark of something long thought forgotten. Hope. Hope in the face of overwhelming odds. Hope fueled by the knowledge that they had something worth protecting, something that the shadow could never claim. Yet, even hope had its limits. Gandalf knew the true measure of the coming storm would not be decided by the strength of any one soldier, no matter how brave. It would not be determined by the walls of the city, or even by the men and women who defended them. No, it would be decided by something more ancient, something far older than Sauron's darkness. It would be decided by will, by the choices made in the face of inevitable defeat. As the battle raged on, Gandalf felt the unmistakable presence of something familiar, something more than the dark forces of Sauron. His mind turned inward for just a moment, and when he opened his eyes, they locked onto the horizon. The shadows gathered in the distance like a gathering storm. It was then that he realized the true battle had not yet arrived. The forces that had attacked the city thus far had been nothing more than a prelude, a feint to draw out the defenders. But the true assault, the true reckoning, was still ahead, and it would come with a force unlike anything they had faced. He turned toward the city, his eyes scanning the faces of those who fought beside him. Their resolve was unshaken, but he could feel the weariness creeping in. They had been holding the line for hours, and every step forward from the enemy was one that drained them of hope. He knew that they could not continue indefinitely. Soon they would be overwhelmed. "Hold the line!" he called to the soldiers near him, his voice steady and commanding, though a part of him knew the battle was slipping from their grasp. "Do not falter. Do not let fear take you. You fight for everything that is good in this world. You fight for your homes, your families, your future. This is our stand. We will not fall." His words carried with them the weight of authority, but even as he spoke, he knew the truth. Their strength was not infinite. They had no reserves left. The city's walls were crumbling, and soon they would no longer be able to withstand the sheer power of the enemy. But still, they held. Still, they fought. And for a moment, just a brief moment, Gandalf allowed himself to feel the warmth of that hope, that shared resolve. But then, a rumble broke through the air, something far deeper than the clash of swords and shields. The ground beneath his feet trembled as though a great force had awoken beneath the earth. He turned his gaze toward the city's gates, and for the first time, a chill ran down his spine. From the distance, a figure began to emerge through the smoke and chaos of the battlefield. It was not one of the orcs, nor one of Sauron's generals. It was something else entirely, a figure draped in dark robes, the air around it seeming to warp and twist with every movement. This was no mere soldier. This was something far worse. The figure moved with an unnatural grace, like a shadow come to life, gliding effortlessly through the battlefield, as if it had no need to walk at all. The soldiers near Gandalf froze as the figure approached, their eyes widening in recognition and fear. This was not a force of nature they could fight, nor a general they could strike down. No, this was something far darker, a being sent from the very depths of Sauron's will. Gandalf's grip tightened on his staff as the figure came closer. He had faced many dark powers in his time, but this was different. This was something born from the very heart of Mordor. It was not a creature of flesh and bone. It was a manifestation of Sauron's will, a tool of his domination. The figure's presence seemed to drain the very light from the air, casting everything in a thick, oppressive darkness. The soldiers who had been fighting with such courage only moments before now found themselves retreating, eyes wide in terror. Their fear was palpable, a tangible thing that spread through their ranks like a disease. Gandalf could feel it, too. It was not just the sight of this creature that terrified them. It was the very aura it exuded, the certainty that they were witnessing the culmination of Sauron's power. This was the end game. This was the moment when all hope would be tested. But Gandalf refused to yield. He knew that this was exactly what Sauron wanted. That fear, that despair. He had seen it in the eyes of men, in the hearts of kingdoms. It was the weapon that could destroy even the strongest, the surest of spirits. He stepped forward, his staff raised high, and he called upon the ancient powers that still flowed beneath the surface of the earth. The air crackled with energy as Gandalf summoned the strength of the earth itself, his voice rising in a chant that echoed across the battlefield. The winds howled, and the very ground seemed to tremble beneath his feet as he gathered the power of the world around him. "By the light of the Valar," Gandalf called, his voice booming over the battlefield, "I command you to turn back. You will not break this city. You will not break these people. This land belongs to the free peoples of Middle-earth." The figure paused, its head tilting slightly as though listening to his words. For a moment, there was nothing but silence. The entire battlefield held its breath. Then, as if amused, the creature raised its hand, and the air seemed to freeze, as if the very essence of time had been suspended. Gandalf could feel the cold, the deep, penetrating cold that radiated from the figure, seeping into his bones. But Gandalf did not falter. He had faced this kind of darkness before, had stood against forces greater than himself, and emerged victorious. This was no different. He was not fighting just for Gondor. He was fighting for every free people in Middle-earth, for every person who had ever dared to hope. He was fighting for the future. The figure took a step forward, and the ground seemed to buckle beneath its weight. But Gandalf did not move. His staff crackled with power, and in that moment he knew that this was the final confrontation. The air was thick with the tension of it, the weight of history pressing down on him. If they were to stand any chance of victory, he had to break the darkness in this moment. He had to remind them of the light that would not be extinguished. The clash of wills was felt across the entire battlefield, a violent, shuddering force that echoed in the hearts of every soldier. It was a struggle, not of strength, but of purpose. and as Gandalf called upon every last ounce of his power, the very ground beneath them seemed to pulse, alive with the energy of the earth itself. The darkness shrieked in response, a sound so horrifying that it seemed to cut through the very fabric of reality. But Gandalf stood firm, his staff glowing with the light of the Valar, a beacon of resistance amidst the overwhelming shadow. And in that moment, the light of Gondor burned brighter than it ever had before. The darkness recoiled, and the creature's form began to dissipate, as if the very light Gandalf had summoned was eroding it from within. But Gandalf knew this victory was only temporary. This was not the end. It was only the beginning. The battle for Middle-earth was far from over. But in this moment, against all odds, hope had found a foothold. And with that, the fight would continue. The creature's form dissolved into the air, like smoke dissipating in the wind, leaving behind only the faintest trace of its presence, a lingering chill that hung in the air like the scent of death. The soldiers of Gondor, standing frozen at the edge of the battlefield, slowly began to breathe again. Their shoulders, once tight with the strain of terror, relaxed slightly as the oppressive weight of the figure's gaze lifted. But Gandalf knew that the victory had not come without a cost. The creature had been but a harbinger of the darkness that Sauron would bring, and though it had receded, the shadow had not. The true battle for the soul of Middle-earth was far from over. He turned his gaze toward the walls of Minas Tirith, watching as the defenders, though still fighting with incredible bravery, showed signs of exhaustion. The battle had been long, and though the first wave had been turned back, they had paid a heavy price. The orcs, trolls, and other dark creatures of Mordor were relentless, their numbers seemingly endless. The ground shook again, and Gandalf could feel the tremors reverberate through the city. He knew what it meant. Another wave was coming. The final assault was upon them. There was no time for rest. Gandalf knew that the defense of the city could not rely solely on the strength of its walls or its soldiers. There was something more that was needed, something that had to be called forth from the depths of the earth itself, something greater than men and their armies. The power of resistance, the strength of the free peoples, had always rested in their will to endure, not to conquer, but to persist. And it was that will that Gandalf now called upon. He moved swiftly toward the inner citadel, where the leaders of Gondor had gathered. Faramir, still steadfast at the front, did not hesitate when he saw Gandalf approach. There was a quiet understanding between them, a bond forged in the fire of war. Faramir's face, once weary, now held a new light, a glimmer of hope that had not been there before. The light of resolve, the same light that had burned in the hearts of Gondor's defenders since the moment the first orc had stepped upon their soil. "We have held," Faramir said, his voice steady, though the weight of the battle hung in the air like a storm ready to break. "But for how long? How much longer can we endure?" Gandalf met his gaze, his expression calm, but his heart heavy with the knowledge that the coming hours would decide the fate of all they had fought for. "As long as you stand," Gandalf said, his voice filled with quiet conviction. "We fight not just for Gondor, not just for Middle-earth, but for the future itself. We fight for every life, every person, every moment of peace that still exists, and we fight because we must. There is no other way." Faramir nodded, understanding the gravity of the situation. "Then we will stand, and we will fight," Gandalf's eyes turned toward the horizon, where the dark clouds of Mordor gathered, swirling like a storm, ready to consume everything in its path. He felt the pulse of the land beneath him, the deep, ancient rhythm that flowed through the world like a heartbeat. It was the heartbeat of Middle-earth itself, the will to resist, to endure, to protect. It was that same heartbeat that had sustained him through all his years of wandering, of guiding, of struggling. It was the heartbeat of every soul that refused to yield. He raised his staff, feeling the power of the earth flow through him. He called upon the ancient forces, the powers that had shaped the world, that had forged the lands and the seas. They were not the forces of domination, but of balance, of protection. Gandalf was no conqueror. He was a protector, a guide, a servant to the greater good. And in this moment, he would call upon those ancient powers to aid him in the final stand. The ground trembled again, but this time it was not the enemy that moved. It was the land itself, awakening to the call of resistance. The earth beneath Minas Tirith shuddered, and the walls of the city began to glow with an ethereal light, the light of the ancient powers of Middle-earth. The sky above darkened, but it was not the darkness of Mordor. It was the darkness of the night before dawn, the stillness before the coming of light. Gandalf's voice rose in a chant, calling upon the powers of the Valar, the guardians of the world, to aid in the defense of the free peoples. His words rang out over the battlefield, a beacon of hope in the midst of despair. The winds picked up, carrying with them the whispers of the Ancient Ones, and the earth itself seemed to respond, shaking off the weight of Sauron's influence. And then, something incredible happened. From the very heart of the city, a wave of energy surged outward, pushing back the forces of darkness, if only for a moment. The orcs faltered, their steps slowing, as if the ground beneath them had turned against them. The trolls roared in confusion, their thick, brutish bodies trembling, as if something greater than themselves had risen against them. But Gandalf knew that this was not the end. It was but a brief reprieve, a moment of resistance. The enemy would regroup, would strike again. Yet in that brief moment, the defenders of Gondor had been reminded of something critical, that they were not alone, that they were not fighting just for themselves. They were fighting for something greater than themselves, for a future that had yet to be written. Faramir's voice rang out across the battlefield, rallying the men to their cause. "To the walls! To the gates! We fight for our homes, for our families, for the future." And with that, the defenders of Gondor surged forward once more, charging into the fray with renewed strength. Gandalf, standing tall amidst the chaos, could feel the energy of the earth flowing through him, guiding him, empowering him. The battle was not over, but they had taken the first step in the fight that would determine the fate of Middle-earth. The armies of Mordor were vast, their strength seemingly without end. But Gandalf knew that this battle would not be won by strength alone. It would be won by the will to endure, by the refusal to give in, by the power of hope and resistance that still burned in the hearts of the free peoples. And in that moment, as the battle raged on, and the forces of darkness pressed ever closer, Gandalf stood firm, knowing that though the night was dark, the light of hope would rise again. The dawn was coming, and with it, a new chance for victory. He raised his staff once more, feeling the pulse of the land beneath him. The battle had only just begun, but Gandalf knew that no matter what came next, The forces of darkness would not have the final word. Not while there was hope. Not while there were those who would fight to the end. And so, with the power of the earth beneath his feet, and the light of resistance in his heart, Gandalf stood tall, ready for whatever came next. The battle for Middle-earth was far from over, but as long as there was hope, as long as there were those who would rise against the darkness, the light would never truly be extinguished.